Huge thanks for having me on. I will talk at governance at length at any time to just about anyone. So really great that I found a group of people willing to listen. With that said, I was instructed that we try to keep these things about half presentation and half Q&A. So we'll try not to go over about 20, 30 minutes here on the talking side, and then we can really engage on what folks want to talk about. So hi, if you don't know me, my name is Payton. I go by Pros11 online. As we mentioned, I am one of the governance facilitators over at Maker DAO. It is a crazy job. I love that gets to be my job, but it's somewhat hard to describe, right? If you're into DAOs and stuff, maybe you have a bit of an idea what a governance facilitator should do, but I find even people that I work closely with don't exactly know what what I should be doing. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today, but in case you're wondering why I have any qualifications for talking about this stuff, it's because I deal with it at Maker all the time, and I make many mistakes and try to write them all down so I can share and prevent others from doing the same. So a little bit about me. I was a political science major, so very much governance nerd material. Not really surprising that when I wound up in Web3, that was kind of what I ended up contributing to. I'm a few years into contributing in the DAO space. Yeah, definitely a less technical contributor. I can barely code anything, but am very into math and other stuff like that. So I kind of had a natural entry, I guess, into this ecosystem. And then something fun about me, I like to play disc golf to relax. I find, especially with DAOs, a lot of time is spent in front of the screen. So having a hobby or something that gets me outside and away from the computer is super important. And little PSA to encourage others to develop something for themselves if they don't have it, because yeah, this space is really something. Cool. So when I was trying to think, like, where do I even begin a talk on consensus, right? Like, obviously, this is a huge thing to blockchains in general, just the mechanism for like determining agreement and truth and all that stuff. But it's also just like a kind of ambiguous concept, right? Like talking to people, if you just say consensus, like someone might tell you like, okay, well, you said there was a consensus, so that means everyone agrees 100%, right? Talking to someone else, you might say like, oh, so there's a consensus, so everyone is like more or less on the same page, right? And I think what makes governance work particularly interesting is we're kind of dealing with that cusp of like, how much is enough? And when I thought of like, where do I start on this journey of like discovering what consensus is, why it's important, how me myself ended up doing this, I'll take you on a little story of my life. And one thing I haven't mentioned so far, I guess, is that I was a creative writing minor. So the story you'll hear is mostly true, with bits added for emphasis. But I also, like, I guess, kind of fancied myself as like a bit different, right? I've always been a bit of an oddball. So for me, a big thing was like trying to be different than my parents, right? I learned as I get older that I become more and more like them in a lot of different ways. But one kind of cool thing you should know about me is that my dad spent several years working at the National Conference for State Legislatures, which is another confusing acronym. So like we're hitting all sorts of DAO micro trends. You can start keeping track if you like on your own. But basically what my dad's entire job was to support the infrastructure of state governments here in the US, right? When you hear about laws and things getting done, you usually hear about national government. His organization's job was to support the actual local government initiatives and people doing with that. So if I could paint a little setting for you, I'd like to take you back to imagine like a third grade Payton. So I was quite young. This is several decades ago. But naturally, as many parents do, my dad came into the classroom to give a talk on kind of what he does. And a lesson I guess I could maybe learn from him is that it's incredibly boring if you actually talk about the the mechanics of governance and day-to-day kind of happenings. But what is really interesting is if you can get people discussing, right? If you can get people actually asking questions. So my dad came to the room rather than starting on what he was going to do as a person, as a profession. He just said, good news. I understand you kids understand hypotheticals, which is really important. So hypothetically, we have infinite budget and infinite pizza maker. And all we need to do in the next 10 minutes is decide what pizza we should buy for this class. And, like I said, in my memory, we all understood hypotheticals very well. I'm sure there was some confusion, though. I'm sure some kids actually thought maybe a pizza was going to come out of this. But to me, this was like one of the foundational moments, right? Like I've asked my dad about it and he barely remembers this talk. He's like, I don't know, I came in several times. We talk about what we do, what have you. But to me, what was so amazing to this was it really demystified like the process of coming to consensus for me. Because basically what he told the class was, okay, so literally no restraints. We can agree on anything. All you have to do is decide that the entire class is okay with a particular pizza. And as you can imagine, it's really hard to get 26 people to agree on anything. And it wasn't long before someone threw out a topping that someone else didn't like, and you start to actually have to make some governance decisions. And while that takeaway is somewhat trivial, I think it really highlighted for me just like how quickly you can get from something like playful and wonderful to something like really ugly and conflict, right? Like, so here's this wonderful thing that's happening. A giant pizza enough to feed an entire class is about to be made. But what happens first is we have to agree on things. And to really stretch the analogy here, let's say like someone proposes having pineapple on a pizza, right? And it's already pretty contentious, right? A lot of people have feelings about pineapple. But hey, someone in the class is allergic to pineapple. So you know what? This one is actually really easy. We'll leave the pineapple out. It was controversial anyway, and someone's allergic. Like we're doing good for the class. We're removing this piece, right? But what happens when it's something like pepperoni, right? Like maybe it's more controversial to not eat meat as opposed to be allergic. And in terms of what actually happened in the story, yeah, it didn't take very long for us to realize that we were either going to have a pizza that was made into like 30 seconds, so everyone could have their own thing, or we weren't going to get a pizza at all. So yeah, I've butchered the storytelling this a little bit, but my point is that my foray into governance really did begin with this notion of how can you take something that's really wonderful, infinite resources or infinite possibility, infinite funding, what have you, and turn it into something terrible. And it's usually the quickest way is to make a whole bunch of people agree on it. And that is my segue to us and talking about DAO governance. So my little catchphrase is governance making easy things hard since the dawn of time. Yeah, like that's really what we come in here to do, right? Like, especially in DeFi, I think the magic of it all is almost more apparent, right? Like when we talk about Maker DAO, we're literally like printing currency, we're printing credit and DAI. Like it's pretty astounding that we have control over this mechanism. But with that power comes great responsibility. And a lot of like semi-obvious but difficult things to implement kind of follow. So the first actual tangible thing that hopefully you can learn here is that voting structures matter. One of the biggest problems with the pizza example and in general with a lot of governance is that people will either choose the wrong voting structure or kind of set themselves up for failure by expecting a higher degree of collaboration and cohesion than maybe naturally exists. Obviously, I mentioned I was a political science student, so I can get like super into voting structures, but like the easiest and like the most apparent example I like to give is pretty similar to this pizza example, only I generally like to do ice cream. And it's the question of like, okay, if you're going to decide which ice cream we should buy for everyone, like you probably like most of your voting methods that you've known all your life are like not really great to deciding this question of how do we get the best ice cream out for the most people. So the shortcut for for voting structures in the ice cream problem is something called approval voting, right? Which is this idea that people would rank all the type of things that they approve, and then you end up with a list of literally the most favorite ice cream out of the entire group. And that's a much better consensus to come to than if you voted on everyone's favorite ice cream, because while people's favorite ice cream might be different than the one people are most okay with serving. And yeah, the shortcut there is like approval voting is generally good when the outcome of the vote is something generally positive, right? So when we think of things like public goods, when we think of things like pizza parties, things that most people aren't going to oppose, and if you were to oppose it, it would be for a specific reason. Oftentimes approval voting structures are really great for that, because you're not really trying to figure out what everyone's favorite is. You're trying to figure out what would cause the least amount of conflict in the group. And I thought I would do a little bit better linking the segue in my head, but what that's supposed to lead us into is this importance of asking why. Like, if you're gonna select a pizza for a class, for example, like what is your goal? Are you trying to make sure that most people are able to be fed? In which case, like dietary restrictions, might be a good thing to start with. Or maybe you're trying to make sure that like a particular person is really happy with the pizza party, right? In which case, maybe their opinion on what pizzas you have is more important. So a lesson within a lesson there is like sometimes like, do you have enough information to even be doing the vote, right? Like, is this something that people actually even care about? And then of course the other takeaway is that I'm doomed to be just like my parents and spend a life in governance and trying to get people to agree on things and collaborate, which I have found to be quite rewarding so far, though admittedly not sure how my dad has done it for so long. Cool. So you might have noticed that in a lot of this talk, I've been talking about a lot of traditional structures, right? Like whether it's nation state voting, pizza selections, things that happen out in the real world as opposed to the digital world. And that was intentional because I think there's a large movement in the space to kind of assume that because we are using new technology, because we are doing things that in many regards haven't been done before, they must be better. And to that I respond, well, it's same, but different, right? Like, yes, this is a new area of innovation. Yes, we're working with technology that people who wrote dusty political science theory books never could have envisioned having access to. But largely, we're still addressing the same problem space, which is how do we take a group of people that largely want to be in a situation together, right? Like these are largely people that have volunteered through some way or another, either through like opting in or through not opting out to be a part of a community. The problem is like, how do we take our shared resources and do something that we can feel good about? Yeah, I keep stumbling on this reoccurring thought that a lot of DAOs are kind of just like college clubs, and I feel like in some ways that's derogatory might be too strong a word, but I can see why some people might take offense to being said like your DAO is kind of like a college club. But in a lot of ways, I think that maybe DAOs should try to be more like college clubs, because a lot of times we're trying to solve a college club problem, which is like a lot of us happen to be here through one way or another in this space focused on this one issue. How can we come together to do something about it? Like that's a great problem space for a club structure to have. we'd like to think maybe maintaining a decentralized currency like DAI is a nobler cause that means that our governance needs to look more like a city-state structure. But I would say that's A, not necessarily the case, and B, part of the brilliance of this all is the speed at which we can test and try new structures out. Like, as opposed to traditional structures, like voting takes a really long time. Like, we can have votes settle really quickly and very verifiably. Like, there's just so many cool secondary effects that happens just because of the blockchain technology, that I feel in some ways we do need to redesign our past, but in a way that we learn from it, right? Like, there's a reason a lot of similarities are shared between nation governments, corporate governance, city-state. Like, a lot of fundamentals in terms of voting rights, in terms of procedure for fair and balanced elections. These are things that we have largely settled throughout time, and we can kind of build on the past to go forward to the future. Okay, got a few more things here. I feel like I've largely just been ranting, but it's a fun subject to rant about, so appreciate the opportunity. I kind of started us off with this question of consensus and how it might mean different things to different people. As Spectrum, I would kind of like us all to envision and maybe like ask ourselves when we're thinking about governance design is like, how much governance is needed for this project or for this end. I actually like, I'm also pretty jazzed up about the ungovernance stuff, right? If you want to be Rye and try to just set a smart contract that's not going to change, or you know, there's other cool ways where you can do ungovernance as well. And that's one end of the spectrum. And then I'm sure we're all very familiar of the other end of the spectrum, which is too much governance, which is everything gets voted on, any minor change, it's just spam, spam, spam. But the kind of third point I would like you to consider, and particularly might help you when you think about what protections and what things you might need to have in place for a successful org, is this idea of a minimum threshold of governance. Like, what is the absolute bare minimum of, you can look at this and say we have governance? And I would argue that line is essentially the line right above anarchy. Like, literally, the minimum form of governance is people just barely holding together in an organized structure. So you technically have governance if people are still more or less willing to submit to the rules and procedures. But the main problem you have is what happens when people stop respecting the rules and procedures of an organization. That's when your governance could be considered lost or failed, right? So thinking about like what the minimum to still be called governance might look like for your org, and how much further down the line you need to make sure you ensure. That's like the type of questions I think we really need to be asking ourselves more when we think about consensus mechanisms. When we ask, okay, what is going to be our our level for making a change, right? When are we going to allow changes to our structure to happen, and how much consensus does there need to be in order for it to be considered an accepted change? Again, kind of a very basic sounding question, much like the pizza, but when you dive into the implications, you get to some really interesting spots. So yeah, I can talk about many things. I really like voting structures. I really like DAO governance. I'm happy to dish about Maker. But when I thought about like where I would like to end my little note to this presentation on, it's kind of about thinking about the future. Particularly, I really want us to come up with better ways for finding agreement, because I think we have a ton of really neat stuff going on in the voting sphere. I'm also really like conviction voting. That really amps me up. I love talking about that, and I think it's such a cool facet that can be utilized. But when like it all comes together, you know, like using a tool is one thing. The question is, how do we actually, on a human personal level, get people to say, you know what, like that idea is okay with me. Like, I do agree. I do consent to this change. And how do we make that happen quicker? That's essentially the problem space for governance. And we have all this awesome technology to make it happen. Yet when we look around, what do we largely see? We largely see like first past the post voting. We largely see like a lot of like Web2 structures in terms of authority, in terms of delegated responsibility, right? So I would argue that like we both think like we're too hot. Like we don't want to go back and read Aristotle and all that stuff because we've moved on. But at the same time, like we if you look at our structures we actually implement, they're almost entirely based on a lot of this old world thinking. So my soapbox is all about like, all right, how do we go back to basics, take a look at what has been uncovered in thousands of years of human history of dealing with this question of consensus, and then how do we apply that to our new technology to make us more efficient? Because making quicker decisions, making better decisions, like this is all things that'll really just accelerate the human species as well as our own ecosystem. So I don't know. I feel like a lot of us. I sometimes wish like I could code better. I wish I could have more of a impact on the smart contract solutions. But when I really think about like the compound effect and how much really does change on whether you have good governance or bad governance, it's like, why would you want to be working on anything else in this space, man? Like governance still has so far to go, and the improvements we make are really going to change how this industry looks in the decades to come. So yeah, not looking to change jobs anytime soon. I guess that's my concluding note for this presentation.